Imagine a city so rich its fishermen cast bronze nets, so proud its emperors still called themselves Roman, and so blind that its own leaders sold the keys to the gates, then acted surprised when the locks no longer worked. That city was Constantinople, the beating heart of what we now call the Byzantine Empire. For 1,000 years it stood as a beacon, a marvel of engineering and culture, surviving plagues, relentless sieges, and every barbarian horde you can probably mispronounce. But when the final curtain fell in 1453, the fatal wound wasn't a cannonball or a barbarian's sword. No, it was something far more insidious, something that had been festering for centuries, a series of disastrous bank transfers, if you will. This isn't just a story of military defeat. It's the epic, tragic tale of how greed, from the imperial palace to the lowliest bureaucrat, turned the majestic Eastern Roman Empire into a going-out-of-business sale, one transaction at a time. It's a stark reminder that sometimes the greatest threats come not from outside your walls, but from within. Chapter 1. The Gilded Cage. Let's rewind a bit, shall we? By 1025, the empire was a colossus, stretching from the mighty Danube to the fertile plains of the Euphrates. Gold poured into imperial coffers from thriving trade routes and a sophisticated tax system. Silk-clad clerks, men of meticulous detail, would weigh taxes by the talent, a unit of weight so significant it speaks volumes about the wealth flowing through this ancient superpower. The Byzantines, heirs to Rome, were masters of administration, and their capital, Constantinople, was unmatched in its splendor and economic vitality. But here's the rub. Money, much like salt, only preserves things when you use it wisely, when you stop shoveling it into your own pockets. Instead, a dangerous trend began to emerge, slowly at first, then accelerating into a systemic rot. Emperors, particularly from the 11th century onwards, started treating high offices of state, these crucial pillars of governance, less like sacred duties and more like personal gift cards. "Congratulations, cousin. You're now prefect of Thessalonica," an emperor might declare. "That'll be 3,000 numismata, please." This wasn't just some harmless family favoritism. These prestigious posts, from provincial governors to military commanders, came with salaries and, more importantly, opportunities for immense personal enrichment, often skimmed directly from the taxpayers. So, every time an office was sold, it meant thinner armies, less effective administration, and fatter, less competent cousins or cronies. It was a classic case of what we'd call rent-seeking today, where individuals use their position to extract wealth without creating any real value for society. They weren't building, they were bleeding the system dry. This practice hollowed out the state from the inside. Imagine trying to run a country when your top officials bought their jobs, knowing their primary goal was to recoup their investment, and then some. Loyalty shifted from the empire to personal gain. The bureaucracy, once a marvel of efficiency, became a labyrinth of patronage and corruption. By the time the Angeloi dynasty took the throne in 1185, the imperial palace, once a symbol of Roman order and grandeur, had started to resemble a high-stakes casino where the house, ironically, always lost. Why? Because the very people running it were pocketing their own chips, gambling away the empire's future for short-term personal profit. The glittering facade remained, but the foundations were crumbling, making it a truly gilded cage, beautiful on the outside, but trapping its inhabitants in a cycle of decline. Chapter 2. Seeds of Corruption. The rot deepened considerably under the Angeloi emperors, a period often cited by historians as a critical turning point where internal decay became undeniable. Isaac II, Angelos, for instance, found himself in a constant scramble for cash. He needed funds to bribe his ever-rebellious generals and maintain a semblance of control. His solution? He didn't just raise existing taxes. He invented new, frankly absurd ones. We're talking taxes on beards, on windows, even on gossip. Can you imagine the outrage? Such arbitrary and petty taxes didn't just annoy the populace. They caused real economic hardship and fostered deep resentment against the imperial authority. People were already struggling, and these new levies felt like a slap in the face, further eroding any remaining trust in their rulers. But his brother, Alexios III, managed to up the ante in spectacular fashion. He didn't just tax. He began auctioning off state assets, including the very instruments of the empire's defense. Famously, one of his high-ranking officials, a man named Michael Striphnos, who was the Megas Dou, commander-in-chief of the Byzantine Navy, systematically sold off the Navy's equipment. We're talking anchors, sails, spare oars, even the nails from the ships. Think about that for a moment. The Byzantine Empire, once a naval power, saw its fleet dismantled piece by piece, not by an enemy, but by its own officials for personal profit. When pirates inevitably started raiding the coasts, Striphnos reportedly just shrugged. What did he care? His treasury was swelling, even as the empire's vital sea lanes became insecure and its maritime power vanished. The navy rotted, the treasury swelled, and the people cursed, feeling increasingly abandoned and vulnerable. The consequences were swift and severe. In 1187, Cyprus, a crucial breadbasket of the empire and a vital source of revenue, revolted, and it never came back. Losing Cyprus wasn't just a blow to imperial prestige, it was a devastating economic hit, further shrinking the empire's agricultural base and tax income. This created a vicious cycle. Revenue dropped, so taxes had to rise even higher on the remaining populace, fueling more discontent and further weakening the state. It was a runaway chariot wheel on a downhill racetrack, picking up speed with every turn, and no one seemed capable or willing to apply the brakes. This unchecked corruption wasn't just a moral failing, it was a direct, tangible weakening of the empire's ability to defend itself and provide for its people. Chapter 3. The Fourth Crusade Price Tag. Just when you thought things couldn't get worse, enter Venice. More specifically, enter Doge Enrico Dandolo, a man with a memory longer than any Byzantine tax scroll and a deep-seated grudge. Decades earlier, the Byzantine Emperor had expelled Venetians from Constantinople, seizing their property and causing immense financial losses. Dandolo, despite being elderly and blind, wanted interest on that old debt. Compound interest, with a vengeance. So, when the Crusaders arrived in Venice in 1202-1203, ready to embark on the Fourth Crusade to the Holy Land, they found themselves in a rather awkward financial predicament. They owed Dandolo and Venice an astronomical sum for transport fees, far more than they could pay. The Doge, ever the shrewd businessman, saw an opportunity not just to get paid, but to cripple a rival and settle an old score. He pointed them towards Zara, a Christian city that was a Venetian rival, and then, with an almost theatrical flourish, he pointed them squarely at Constantinople. That vault, he must have thought, will cover it. The Crusaders, desperate and debt-ridden, agreed to this shocking diversion from their original holy mission. Inside Constantinople, meanwhile, the Byzantine elite was in its usual state of self-inflicted chaos. An exiled prince, Alexios IV Angelos, promised the Latins absurd sums of money and military support if they helped him seize the throne from his uncle, Alexios III. The Crusaders obliged, placing Alexios IV on the throne. But the city revolted, tired of the constant infighting and the foreign presence. Alexios IV was soon strangled by a rival faction, Alexios V Ducas. Now, the Crusaders were unpaid, angry, and had a convenient pretext for revenge. They decided to collect their payment with swords, and what followed was one of the darkest chapters in European history, the sack of Constantinople in April 1204. For 3 horrifying days, the city that had stood for nearly a millennium as the bastion of Christian civilization was subjected to an unimaginable orgy of looting, pillaging, and wanton destruction. Churches were desecrated, priceless relics melted down for coin, and even the magnificent bronze horses from the hippodrome were pried loose and shipped off to Venice. The sheer scale of the plunder was staggering. Crusader chroniclers themselves admitted to finding more wealth than they could have imagined. This wasn't just a military conquest, It was an act of economic warfare that gutted the empire. Constantinople never truly recovered its former glory or its economic vitality. The Byzantine Empire was shattered, fragmented into various successor states, and spent the next 57 years as a frayed patchwork, ruled from exile in Nicaea. The Fourth Crusade wasn't just a symptom of Byzantine weakness, it was a direct, catastrophic exploitation of that weakness, fueled by external greed and internal folly, from which the empire would never fully heal. Chapter 4. Selling the Empire Piece by Piece. When Michael VIII Palaiologos, a brilliant but ruthless general, finally retook Constantinople in 1261, restoring a semblance of the old empire, he found the capital a shadow of its former self. The treasury, after decades of Latin rule and the initial sack, was completely empty. Rebuilding was an urgent necessity, but where do you find the money when your empire has been economically ravaged? Michael's solution, born of desperation and strategic necessity, was to turn to the powerful Italian maritime republics, Genoa and Venice. He borrowed heavily from Genoa, often at exorbitant rates, sometimes as high as 20% interest. In return for their financial aid and, crucially, their naval support. Remember, the Byzantine navy was effectively gone thanks to Michael Striphnos. He signed away significant economic privileges. The Treaty of Nymphaeum in 1261, for instance, granted Genoa extensive commercial rights, including control over the Galata quarter, directly across the Golden Horn from Constantinople. This meant Genoa effectively controlled a vital part of the city's commerce, complete with its own customs duties, siphoning off revenue that should have gone to the Byzantine state. Of course, Venice, ever the keen rival, wasn't going to stand idly by. They soon returned, demanding similar, if not greater, privileges. Emperors felt they had little choice but to oblige, because refusal often meant embargo, or worse, open hostility from these powerful naval states. Bit by bit, the Byzantine state mortgaged its economic sovereignty. Trade routes, harbor taxes, even the right to weigh bread at market. All these fundamental aspects of economic control were increasingly handed over to Italian city-states. This had devastating consequences for the native Byzantine economy. Foreign merchants, particularly the Venetians and Genoese, were often exempt from tariffs and duties that local Byzantine traders had to pay. By 1340, it was an absurd reality. Foreign merchants paid lower tariffs than native farmers. This created an incredibly uneven playing field, crippling local Byzantine guilds and enterprises. Gold, instead of circulating within the empire to stimulate its own economy, flowed outwards, enriching foreign powers. The once vibrant Byzantine merchant class dwindled, unable to compete with the privileged Italians. The empire effectively became a renter in its own house, losing control over its economic destiny. Its economic arteries were now controlled by foreign entities, bleeding it dry. This wasn't just a financial drain, it was a profound loss of self-determination, leaving the empire vulnerable and dependent, a mere shadow of its former economic might. Chapter 5. The Chickens Come Home to Roost. By the 14th century, the Byzantine Empire was a shadow of its former self, a tattered remnant clinging to life. And then, the new, formidable threat emerged. The Ottoman Turks, crossing into Europe and establishing a foothold. This was a crisis that demanded a strong, unified response, but Byzantium, hollowed out by centuries of greed and misrule, simply couldn't deliver. The treasury, repeatedly plundered, sold off, and mismanaged, was utterly barren. When the empire desperately needed to buy mercenaries to bolster its defenses, all it could offer were IOUs from a drunk gambler. Nobody was willing to lend to a state that couldn't pay its bills, a state whose financial credibility was in tatters. The once feared Byzantine army, a symbol of Roman might for 1,000 years, had shrunk to a pitiful force. A few thousand half-paid Italian mercenaries and some archers whose bows still carried pawnshop tags from the 1204 sack. This wasn't just a lack of funds. It was a complete breakdown of the state's capacity to provide its most basic public good, defense, and if external threats weren't enough, the Byzantine elite seemed determined to finish the job themselves through endless, ruinous civil wars. Take John Cantacuzénos, for example. In the 1340s, desperate to win his civil war against John V Palaiologos, he made a truly Faustian bargain. He bribed Turkish cavalry, the very forces that would soon become the empire's greatest existential threat, to fight for him. As a down payment, he handed over Gallipoli. This was a catastrophic error, a short-sighted act of self-interest that would have irreversible consequences. Gallipoli, a strategically vital peninsula, became the Ottomans' first permanent foothold in Europe. It was an open invitation, a clear message. Come on in, the continent's open for business. As the saying goes, if you invite the wolf to dinner, don't act shocked when he leaves with the leg of lamb, or in this case a crucial piece of your territory that would serve as a springboard for future conquests. This act of inviting foreign powers to intervene in internal disputes, offering them territory as payment, was a recurring theme in the empire's final centuries. It perfectly illustrates how the internal greed for power, the relentless infighting among the elite, directly paved the way for external domination. By 1400, the once sprawling empire was reduced to little more than a city-state with a few scattered suburbs. By 1451, it was just Constantinople itself, a lonely island in a rising Ottoman sea, with a very nervous mayor, desperately clinging to its last breath. The chickens, after centuries of internal corruption and external concessions, were well and truly home to roost. Chapter 6. The Final Auction. By 1453, Constantinople stood as the last bastion, surrounded by the formidable Ottoman forces under Sultan Mehmed II. Emperor Constantine XI Palaiologos, the last Roman emperor, knew the end was near unless a miracle occurred. He tried the Hail Mary playbook, touring Europe, begging for ships, men, and money from the Western kings. He pleaded for Christendom to unite against the looming Islamic threat. But the Western response was cold, if not outright hostile. "We remember 1204, they seemed to say, referring to the devastating sack of Constantinople by the Fourth Crusade. Clean your own attic." The deep schism between Eastern Orthodoxy and Roman Catholicism, exacerbated by centuries of mistrust and the memory of Latin atrocities, proved too wide to bridge. Political rivalries and their own internal struggles meant few cared to ride to Byzantium's rescue. Only a few answered the call, driven by a mix of personal honor, Christian duty, or perhaps lingering commercial interests. Notably, Giovanni Giustiniani, a Genoese mercenary captain, arrived with 700 men. He was so committed that he reportedly mortgaged his own estates to fund his contingent, a stark contrast to the Byzantine elite. Inside the besieged city, the internal decay was still painfully evident. While some fought valiantly, others continued their petty squabbles and self-serving acts. Greek aristocrats, valuing their personal treasures over the collective good, hid precious icons rather than melting them down for defense funds. Imagine the irony: religious devotion prioritized over the very survival of their Christian city. Meanwhile, Venetian captains, ever pragmatic, were busy negotiating escape clauses for their ships, just in case the mighty Theodosian walls failed. Even in the face of annihilation, self-interest and a lack of unified purpose plagued the city's defense. On May 29, 1453, the inevitable happened. Ottoman cannon, far superior to anything the Byzantines possessed, punched through the ancient, once impregnable Theodosian walls. The final assault began. In the chaos, Constantine XI, refusing to flee or surrender, reportedly cast aside his imperial regalia. He died fighting, leading a desperate last charge alongside his men, indistinguishable from the common soldiers, because tragically, the imperial coffers couldn't even afford a new cuirass for their emperor. He died a Roman, defending what was left of Rome, a stark and poignant end to a 1,000-year empire. Conclusion. So, the 1,000-year empire, the glorious successor to Rome, finally fell. But it didn't fall because it forgot how to fight. It fell because it forgot why it should fight. Greed had turned emperors into pawnbrokers, selling off the empire's future for today's comfort. It had turned officials into opportunistic pickpockets, enriching themselves at the expense of the state and its people. And it had turned citizens into jaded spectators, alienated from a corrupt system, losing faith in their leaders and their collective destiny. When the Ottoman siege guns finally roared their terrible symphony, the treasury echoed like an empty jar. There were no funds for defense, no unified will to resist, no deep well of loyalty to draw upon. The grand and terrible lesson of Byzantium is this: walls of gold, no matter how thick or glittering, can't defend a city if the key holders auction off the locks. This isn't just ancient history, it's a timeless warning. The Byzantine experience vividly illustrates how unchecked corruption erodes institutional efficiency, depletes state resources, and alienates the populace, creating fertile ground for both internal collapse and external exploitation. It's a historical mirror reflecting modern concepts like rent-seeking and the devastating impact of a lack of public trust in governance. So remember that next time you hear a politician selling tomorrow for today's comfort, or an official prioritizing personal gain over public service, Byzantium did it, century after century, until all that was left was a tragic story and a new name for its capital. Today, we call it Istanbul. If this story made you rethink shortcuts versus long-term strength, if it made you see the subtle, corrosive power of greed, then hit subscribe. History doesn't repeat, but it certainly invoices. Make sure you're not the one stuck paying the bill for someone else's short-sightedness.